Hey guys, it's Dave here. Welcome back. I'm sure most of you by now have seen the amazing videos of Starship's first orbital test flight. Really exciting stuff. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend checking it out. The launch vehicle did successfully clear the pad, go up almost 40 kilometers into the air before finally having a pretty spectacular explosion. Not something you see every day. Giant dust clouds, debris hitting everything. It was really quite exciting. So obviously with this big event, we've had a ton of media coverage. Social media has been blowing up talking about Starship. It's kind of been the biggest thing. And I figured this would be a perfect time to share my thoughts on Starship and how it's going to affect Rocket Lab as well as the overall space industry in general. Before we get to that though, if you're new here and you do enjoy investing in space companies, I invite you to subscribe by the end of the video. I do cover a lot of space companies regularly, several times a week. Before we get to that though, I hope if you're new here, you will consider subscribing, especially if you're interested in investing and in space companies. I cover investing in space companies extremely regularly. And if you're not new here, every like and comment does help out with the YouTube algorithm. So thanks so much. So as you might imagine, I follow the space industry quite closely. I follow a lot of people on Twitter and I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and I found two common viewpoints through a lot of my research. One side seems to think that SpaceX and Starship is just going to gobble up the entire space industry. There's no point in investing in anyone who isn't SpaceX. Nobody will be able to compete with them. They're too big, they're too good, they're too scaled up already, and you might as well just go home because SpaceX is not publicly traded, so no point in investing in any other launcher. It's really doomed to fail. Then I've heard some other Rocket Lab investors talking about how it's silly to worry about rocket like Starship's not even flying yet. It's so much more massive than the Neutron or any other rockets that we're looking at right now in the commercial space, and you really shouldn't even worry about it. It's not going to matter. There's going to be enough demand for everyone to go around. Just ignore Starship and continue investing in your other companies as you would as if SpaceX doesn't exist. And now I'm hoping to give a bit more of a nuanced take on this, where I think about, yes, of course, if Starship is successful, it will have a massive impact on the whole launch industry. SpaceX aims to really decrease the cost per kilogram to orbit, and obviously that can have a big impact in anyone who's launching anything. But there's a lot of more complications to it than just the kilograms to orbit. As is normal with life, this is a lot more complicated than you might think. So just wanted to share some of my own thoughts on that, hopefully a more balanced view. Now, first of all, let's just get this out of the way right away. There's been a lot of debate online about whether this Starship test flight was a success or not. You've seen a lot of people out there actually making fun of SpaceX, saying, they just blew up $1 billion rocket. This is a disaster. How could they possibly claim that this is a success? And a lot of other people saying, this was a success. It was a first test flight. Yes, it exploded. They got a lot of great data. And it's funny because I think a lot of people who are saying this is a massive failure do not actually usually cover the space industry, and they don't really realize this is a new type of development strategy from SpaceX. They plan to destroy rockets in order to push things to the limits, see what fails, fix what fails, blow up another one, see what else failed, fix that, instead of spending years and years trying to perfect every little piece before launching. Just get some prototypes up there, explode them, see what goes wrong, and fix it is kind of the design philosophy. So overall, I would say this launch was more successful than not. However, there is some caveats with that, which is that there was some massive damage to their ground infrastructure, which is a bit of a blow to the whole program. It's going to take a lot of delays to repair some of that damage to the launch pad. I'm sure we've all seen pictures. I'll share some of them now. And really, the rocket basically just dug a crater below its launch pad. So clearly something needs to be done, whether flame diverter system, water suppression, or some other system needs to be in place. But that will delay development of the Starship and the next launch for sure. Another concern that a lot of people have, and I think is well-founded, is around SpaceX's Raptor engine. This was first in development, I believe, all the way back in like 2012. We had heard talk of SpaceX beginning to work on a new methane-powered rocket engine. And for something that's been in the works for so long under development, the reliability of this engine is still not really where it needs to be, in my opinion. We saw 3 engines fail right away at liftoff, and then another few failed during the flight out of the total 33 engines. So if you're putting humans on this thing eventually, or even just planning to launch regularly, reliably, the Raptor, I believe, still needs some work. They still need to get to the point where they can mass produce it quickly, cheaply, at scale, and have it be an extremely reliable engine like we've seen with the current Merlin engine on the Falcon 9. So still a long way to go for Raptor, and for those reasons, that in the launch pad, I wouldn't say it's a complete resounding success. Still mostly successful, but clearly a lot of work needs to be done. And no, this isn't an abysmal failure and a disaster for SpaceX like some articles might have you believe. Now, another concern for this rocket development program is actually the heat shield. I know if a lot of you remember the shuttle days when we were launching astronauts to the space station by the shuttle, the initial promise of the shuttle was that it was going to be a reusable vehicle, which would significantly reduce the cost of flight to space by being the first reusable vehicle. And it really didn't pan out that way, and a lot of that had to do with the heat shield. They had a lot of problems with the heat shield suffering damage and not working properly and causing massive time and expense to repair and refurbish it after every flight. The heat shield on SpaceX's Starship still hasn't really been tested fully, as they didn't get to orbit to re-enter, and it does look like it's got a lot of complexity to it and a lot of issues with it. So that's another area of concern for the Starship that they're going to have to take a look at and figure out how they can mass produce these more easily and make sure that it's still safe after multiple reflights. Now, all that was really a long way of saying that I think Starship still has a lot of work ahead of it, but I still think it can have a very bright future and significantly bring down the cost of mass to orbit. So, with that opinion in mind, we have to ask ourselves as space investors, how is this going to affect other space companies we're investing in? Some names that I look at a lot are the likes of Rocket Lab, obviously, as well as Planet Lab, ASTS, Terran Orbital, and a lot of these other satellite players. And I really just wanted to think about how Starship, if it does become successful, will affect the overall industry and Neutron specifically. So if you're not aware, SpaceX has set a goal of making their Starship launches be cheaper than their current Falcon 9 launches, which is an extremely difficult feat to achieve. We're talking about a vehicle that can deliver almost 9 times the amount of payload to low Earth orbit than their current rocket, which goes for about $67 million per launch, and they want to be able to launch this vehicle cheaper. What I think I can tell you with confidence is that there's no chance anytime soon Starship is going to be launching for $67 million. Maybe way down the line they're hoping to get there aspirationally, but I think I can tell you with great certainty that it's going to cost more than $67 million for the foreseeable future, at least, to launch Starship. Just the sheer amount of ground infrastructure required, the crazy amount of fuel, and how difficult it is to refuel their ground stations, the materials required, all the people and employees, scheduling. It's really a massive undertaking to launch a single one of these. Yes, the stainless steel body is much cheaper than carbon fiber, so that is one point it has going for it, but I don't think that's enough to overcome all these other costs and bring it down cheap enough. But having said that, I'm not saying that that will make Starship a failure. There's definitely a case to be made that this will be an extremely useful vehicle, even if they don't ever get to that price point. Now, additionally, when you're talking about Starship's impact on the overall launch market, you have to remember that once Starship does become operational, most of their initial launches are already planned to be used up for their Starlink constellation. And actually, if you look at the video of how they're planning on deploying these satellites with this slim opening to shoot satellites out almost like pizzas out of an oven or something like that, you really couldn't even launch any different sized satellites from this. Any, more traditional shaped satellites wouldn't fit through that opening. So there's no real way for these initial Starships to even really be a competitor on the commercial markets for the near future. So first question, and probably the easiest to answer when we look at the overall launch market, we'll start with the small launch market, is what impact would Starship have on small launch? And for that, I think I can say with confidence, extremely little impact. Now, I've been saying for weeks now, I'm more and more convinced that Electron is going to be a great product in the future. I'm becoming more and more confident in it, and I really don't see Starship impacting it in any way. This massive 150-ton vehicle compared to another one that just sends 300 kilograms to low Earth orbit, they're just in a completely different playing field. There's already a rideshare option for small satellites in the Falcon 9, and that doesn't work for everyone. And why is that? Well, you've got to get your specific small satellite to a certain orbit, a certain time of day. Scheduling doesn't always work out. So if we're talking about a new vehicle 9 times larger than the current rideshare option, there's just no way you can accommodate getting all these tiny, small satellites to their proper location as needed. Even if they were able to get the launch costs down shockingly low to, say, $10 million or lower, you still have to think about the opportunity cost you're wasting here to send one tiny CubeSat to one specific location on a 150-ton rocket. It really doesn't make a lot of sense when you could send massive payloads up there. So I do think the small launch market is not going to be impacted. Electron is going to be quite fine. It's going to be a profitable product operating at 50% gross margin for years, and there's no need to worry about that end of the market. So now let's talk a little about the medium lift market, and this is where Neutron will fall into once it's up and operational. Neutron will be launching 13 tons in reusable mode while landing downrange, and the cost for Neutron will be $50 million per launch. This is comparable to a Falcon 9 launch today in terms of cost per kilogram, but it is slightly smaller than a Falcon 9. And the first question you have to ask is, well, how much capacity will there be for Starship over the next decade or so? And what you have to think about is, first of all, as I said, most Starship launches for the near future are going to be devoted towards Starlink launches. You have to think that even when the full Starlink constellation is up and operational, each Starlink satellite only lasts about 5 years before they deorbit. They have too much atmospheric drag and they re-enter the atmosphere. So there will be a constant process of replenishing those satellites as well as upgrading them with newer versions, expanding the constellation, etc., etc. And that will definitely take up a good amount of Starship capacity for the foreseeable future. And then we have the Artemis program. SpaceX has already contracted with NASA to provide a lunar lander for the Artemis program. And when you send the Starship to the moon, you have to keep in mind this isn't just one launch. What they do is they send it to low Earth orbit, but then it's out of fuel. They have to send several more launches of a tanker to refuel the ship before getting it to the moon. So a single Starship to the moon is actually going to cost you many launches, not just one. And beyond the NASA launches for Artemis, we also have the Dear Moon mission. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Dear Moon is eventually a success. You'd see a lot more tourist-style missions to the moon and beyond, so that would obviously require a lot of Starship launches. In addition to that, obviously, it would make a lot of sense for Starship to be used for deep space science missions, sending scientific satellites and instruments out to, the Jovian moons and deeper into the solar system, something we haven't been doing very much of lately, and Starship should be well suited for sending large payloads at low costs to these distant destinations. And then last but not least, of course, we have Elon's ambitions for Mars. Now, a lot of people love him, a lot of people hate him. And what I will say is that either way, I do think he's dead serious about wanting to set up a colony on Mars at some point. And he's absolutely willing to launch Starship at a loss to send payloads and cargoes to Mars to get things ready for potentially eventual colony or science mission. It's not just all about the money here. He's talked so much about Mars, and he really does want to do it. So down the line, not anytime soon, certainly not on the timelines I think we've been hearing him talk about, we could even be seeing Starship launches to Mars, which would again require many tanker refills to get the Starship fueled up and ready to go and sent to Mars. So that's a lot more launches and a lot more capacity being taken up. And I know we've talked about having these Starships be reusable theoretically maybe within the same day. I really don't think that's ever going to happen, at least anytime soon. You'll definitely have to inspect those heat shields, make sure they're still safe. Even refueling, the current fuel farm takes 2 days just to refill to fuel up a new rocket. So how are you going to launch one of these things every day? Definitely a lot of expansion would be needed on the ground before anything like that is available. Plus you need to have all the landing infrastructure. Again, you've got to be able to catch all these rockets, store them different places. You've got your tankers as well as many different first stages, the second stages. There's just a lot going on there. So I really don't think we're talking about launching one of these every single day anytime soon anyway. I know that's the aspirational goal down the line. So all that out of the way, when we're talking about the commercial market for Starship, I think it will have a place. It will be more suited for those massive constellations like a Starlink, like maybe an Amazon's Kuiper, although I don't know if Amazon would ever be willing to pay SpaceX for all their launches. They have a bit of a competition going on there, so it remains to be seen if they'd even be willing to do that. But there's so many other smaller constellations out there that probably don't even need a Starship launch. Talking about the Planet Labs of the world, the Black Skies. We've got ASTS Space Mobile, Terran Orbital. So many other players will need launches, and they probably don't need 150 tons to orbit for these smaller constellations that are still going to be performing critical work and maybe only need, a 40, 60 satellite constellation, not, 10,000 satellites in orbit. So that's where I think there will be a solid market for Neutron, is some of these smaller constellations that aren't going to need a massive launch, and Starship will still, even if it's launching for $200 million, it's a very successful vehicle for the amount of payload it carries to orbit, but that doesn't eat the entire medium launch market by any means. So in the commercial space, I believe over the next decade, there should be plenty of space in the market for both Starship, Neutron, and maybe some other new players that we're looking at, or whether it's a Relativity, a New Glenn, an ABL Space, Firefly. Well, there's a lot of rockets under development right now, and it makes the future of space very exciting. And I think there'll be room for several players. We're not just going to see Starship take the entire industry. Also, when it comes to the commercial space markets, we're seeing a lot of governments ramp up their spending in space. They want their own satellites in orbit themselves, especially when you look at incidents like Ukraine today. And it's more important than ever to have your own defense and imaging assets in orbit. And when the government is looking at giving out these contracts for launch, they always try to make sure that they're fostering a competitive space environment. So we've already seen this with the small launch space. The government will give out contracts to Rocket Lab, ABL, Firefly, Relativity, even Astra, Virgin Orbit, basically anyone who tries to start up launch. They tend to get a few contracts from Department of Defense, the government, Space Force, whoever, because they try to build and foster a competitive commercial space launch environment. They're not going to ever just give all the launches to one vehicle. That would just lead to a monopoly, a very bad environment in the long run for everyone, including SpaceX, with no competition and complete stagnation in the industry. Not even to mention the fact that monopolies are illegal and not allowed. The other factor worth considering for space investors is how all this development is going to affect other players that we look at, players who don't have their own launch capability, but do make and operate satellites in orbit. There's a lot of interesting companies out there I've covered previously, companies like a Planet Labs, like a AST Space Mobile, Terran Orbital, Black Sky. There's a ton of them out there, and basically it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that all this competition, all these new rockets coming online, all these new companies trying to get into the launch space is really going to drive down the cost of launch. So if you're just building and operating a satellite, it's definitely going to be great for you to be able to launch for so much cheaper than you would have a decade ago. Definitely going to have a lot more players in the satellite industry. They're going to be able to be more profitable. The only question mark is whether these launchers want to operate their own satellites and eventually will be, offering less launches to the commercial market. But that's a discussion for a whole nother day. I think at least short to medium term, this is all really great news for anyone in the space industry outside of launch. So when it comes to Neutron, they've already got contracts with the government. You can expect a lot of DoD type contracts going forward. They've already worked with the government in making sure their rocket will meet the majority of their needs going forward. It can fit 90% plus of potential payloads out there because, you know, most satellites are not, 100 tons or anything like that by any means. And then, of course, Rocket Lab is planning to own, operate, and build their own satellites and launch them into orbit themselves, obviously. So a lot of that capacity will end up being taken up by their own satellites, and they'll be able to operate that at cost and make their money off of the satellite services. So there'll always be demand for Neutron internally from Rocket Lab as well. So ultimately, after decades of stagnation in the space industry, after the shuttle program failed and we had no way to get American astronauts into space or Western astronauts into space other than Russia, we're finally starting to see the commercial space launch market come to fruition. We've got a lot of new competitors pushing new vehicles. Starship is obviously one of the most prominent ones, and they're going to help drive down the cost of launch for everyone. But there should be room in this new industry for Neutron as well as other players. This is going to make the future of the whole space industry very bright. I'm hoping for Neutrons to succeed, but also I'm hoping for Starship to succeed and everyone else, and we have a vibrant future space economy. So as a Rocket Lab investor, I say good luck to SpaceX. Definitely good luck to Rocket Lab and Neutron. I have a lot of confidence in their ability to execute on Neutron's design. I think I'm going to make a future video just talking about some of the amazing design decisions Rocket Lab has made on Neutron and what makes that vehicle so unique and so special. And the future should be bright for both vehicles. I look forward to seeing the first Neutron test launch and the next test launch of the Starship. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it to the end of the video, I'd love to hear down in the comments what you thought of the Starship test launch, what you think of Neutron versus Starship, and how both these vehicles will fare in the future space economy. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.